Okay, so welcome to our second lecture today. I trust that everything is working correctly. Please remember to record your attendance as usual. And check the message in the chat about the opening of a WhatsApp group for you, which one of your colleagues here has kindly launched, and we'll also write the link maybe on the Blackboard if you want later. Yeah, I want to do that. You want to do that now?
No, am I allowed to post the message on Blackboard? Isn't it only the professor?
Sorry?
Am I allowed to post the message on Blackboard? Or is it, I thought it was only the professor.
Yeah, I mean, you can do however you prefer. Yeah, it's not a problem. I'm very happy to advertise that as you prefer. Now, how we were discussing earlier this morning, for those of you who weren't in class, the point is that we have different groups of explanations of the grid divergence, so the process leading the, sorry, why did the video, okay. I don't know why, because I already opened the video, but now we should also have the video. I was anticipating the fact that we have different groups of explanation of the grid divergence, so the process leading Western Europe to acquire an edge over all other world areas, including over East Asia, which till a certain point was, as far as we can measure, was about on par with Western Europe in terms of general levels of development. And I was telling in class that this discussion about the moment when the grid divergence begins is not trivial, because if we could agree on the timing, we could at least reduce the number of alternating explanations, basically. And then, of course, you find in the literature some possible evidence about the onset of the divergence. For example, there is a growing literature on per capita GDP, historical estimates of per capita GDP. I was mentioning the fact that if you look at the estimates, for example, provided by Brodberry for England, northern Italy, or central northern Italy, because he says Italy, but that's the center north, or more properly, the north plus Tuscany, which in fact is only Tuscany for the period preceding the 16th century. So there are problems with those estimates. And China, you can see that already circa 1400 you would have central northern Italy, or Tuscany, at a level much higher. And then, if we remain in the same framework, you see that England starts rising. After a certain moment in time, it overcomes the levels of Italy. This happens in this estimate from the beginning of the 18th century, basically. Italy declines a bit in between 1400 and 1850, and China goes down quite significantly, right? So you have the inversion between Northern and Southern Europe, with the North acquiring an edge over the South, so the so-called little divergence, which we will also cover in this class. So you have to, as we have changed the room physically, I have to stick to a different part of the floor in order not to get out of the video. So apologies if I disappeared for a moment. I still need to kind of, learn how to navigate this different space, basically. So what's the point? What's the problem here? The problem is here that this would be all, very nice and good if we could actually believe these numbers. And I'm not telling you that these shouldn't be believed. I can tell you that the estimates for Central and Northern Italy are, from my point of view, particularly low quality. They're also among those which have been produced earlier. Those for England are the best available for any country in the world so far. And these have been published in an important book by Brodberry, Bruce Campbell, and Mark Overton, which actually uses a lot of evidence, all the evidence that you currently have, which might be used for these purposes, But still, these haven't to be taken literally. For England, there is kind of a consensus that we should take these now if we want to have at least an idea. For Italy, there is not even a consensus. So these numbers are highly debated. For Asia, we are at the beginning of this process of producing estimates, and especially for the earlier period, these are very unstable in the sense that a different estimate can come up next year and be totally different, right? So the point is, this evidence does suggest that the onset of the great divergence was early. But was that the 14th century? Was that the 16th century? You know, it will be difficult to tell based only on this evidence, because then it becomes kind of self-referential, if you want. Then the problem, of course, is also that you might wonder how you can produce estimates of per capita GDP for countries which were squarely in the pre-statistical period. So GDP is a measure invented for a modern 20th century society. You want to apply it to a pre-statistical society, you have to come up with an estimate based on evidence which is not meant to be used in that way, the original evidence, right? There are different methods for doing this, right? But there is also reason to say that other indicators which are closer to the actual observed evidence might be preferable for now. For example, urbanization rates, which we already discussed, or real wages. Because at least real wages, or wages in general, can be estimated based on the surviving archival sources. So you know how much in certain big construction projects in certain cities, for example, workers of different kinds were paid along, decades, if not centuries. And then you can compare that in different areas for similar jobs, and then see whether wages are comparable. Of course, you want to transform that in real terms because you want to compare the purchasing power of those wages. So the point here is that as we still don't agree on the timing based on the measures, we are still discussing the causes of the great divergence in a much broader, if we want, a much broader way. So we are kind of keeping open different possibilities. I would say that there is a growing body of evidence that divergence begins at least in the early modern period, but still, given, again, the difficulties we have in measuring these for East Asia, we remain uncertain to some degree. And then, again, it's proper to discuss all alternatives. Now, what's interesting in per capita GDP is that maybe you are not used to think about this in this way, but that's a demo economic variable because you have, of course, at the numerator GDP, and which is an economic variable, and the denominator you have total population, right? Because it's a per capita measure. And then, if you wanted to describe product, total product, or if you want GDP, as a function only of population, generally speaking, you would get to a curve like this, right? So you have population density, or population, because in the end, population density is population divided by a constant, which is the surface you are looking at. And then you have production here. If you consider this only as a function of population, which means basically you are keeping constant capital and technology constant, right? Because you are estimating this as product as a function solely of labor, you have a curve like this. Why this shape of the curve? This is because of fundamental economic law. Which one? Why these and not these? Or an exponential? Where does this shape come from? Capital, in this case, include length, of course, all capital. And I'll tell you more about that soon. Technology is constant. Why this shape? This basically means that after a certain level, if you add a unit of work, you will get ever less in terms of product. That's the law of diminishing returns, which gives this shape to the curve, right? Now, the point is that in the graph, country 2, in country 2, per capita GDP is the gradient of the line from the origin to the point, because that's y divided by p, let's call this population, okay? So it's the gradient of that, the inclination. Now the point is that when you move along this line, you will have this declining, and this means that that in that graph, country 2 has a lower per capita GDP than country 1. Now, why this is relevant for our discussion? You remember I was mentioning the Black Death before, right? The terrible pandemic which affects Europe in 1347 to 52 and kills half of the people of Europe. The Black Death might be something which brings you from the situation of country 2 to country 1. Higher per capita GDP. Why? Because capital, but in this case what is crucial is land, so natural resources in general become more abundant in per capita terms. Societies of Europe and the Mediterranean on the eve of the Black Death were experiencing a shortage of resources, basically. We have many signs of this. For example, we have terrible famines spreading in the European area in the decades before the Black Death. And then this exogenous shock gives space for change. And here you can interpret this, for example, as moving to an earlier phase of this curve, right? In which per capita GDP is higher for a period. Now, when we think about real wages, and this is the connection, is that real wages tell you the inclination of the tangent to this curve. Because real wages correspond to the wage paid in a situation in which you employ the extra worker, and due to the conditions in the labor market, you have to pay exactly the revenue that the worker produces. So the equilibrium wage will be that. And we will not employ anybody more, because then you're going to pay them more than they produce, more than the revenue they produce. So the point is that this graph tells you why, if we look at real wages, and again, the advantage of looking at real wages is that they are more directly connected with the historical evidence that we have. So there are still a lot of hypotheses which go into producing them, because they're not the numbers which come straight from the archival sources. You need, for example, to factor in the prices, right? We want to compare real wages looking at comparable baskets of consumption in general. We want to take into account inflation. We want to look at them, we want to look at the wages in a way in which they reflect the actual purchasing power, right? Anyway, the point is that tells you why you can look at real wages and infer something also about per capita GDP. Because the wages in country 2, which correspond to the inclination of the tangent curve, will be lower than the wages in country 1. which is reasonable. Think again about the Black Death. When the Black Death strikes Europe, real wages increase. Why do they increase? Well, they increase because labor becomes scarce. So the workers can get a better bargain from their employers, right? Or also from people who kind of provide them with the land. Now, just this, it's not like this is the first of a zillion of economic graphs. It's just to kind of clarify that there is a connection. Now, let me add just one thing. When I tell you that technology is constant and capital is constant, you have to remember two additional things. What happens to this curve in a Malthusian scenario? We'll go back to the Malthusian economy in general later. But what happens to these if I improve the technology? So this is the original situation. I have a change in technology. Consider that in pre-industrial societies, technology changes very slowly, generally speaking. If I improve the technology, the production improves, but for every level population. So I move from this situation to this situation, okay? Now, the important thing here is that this changes the levels of production, or population, whatever, but this, in terms of equilibrium, you will reach again an equilibrium in which you pay the marginal wage, so the wage which corresponds to the revenue, but that will be at a higher population level, right? The crucial point is that the nature of the problem doesn't change. Because as you can't, for a pre-industrial society, you can't factor in a continuous technological change which continuously displaces this, at least if you reason in Malthusian terms. This is what Malthus said, not the new Malthusian said, and there is any number of economic model which makes different assumptions, right? But if you think in Malthusian terms, this doesn't change the problem. The problem is always the same. The population will constrain what you can achieve, and then you will always reach a situation in which the worker will be basically a subsistence. Because, again, country 2 will reach a higher total production at the same level, because it is higher, but then when you move from 2 to 1, you will experience the same dynamics because of the shock and so forth and so on. So the nature of the interaction between the variables doesn't change. The second thing that you need to remember, maybe, if you're interested in these kind of things, is that today, in neoclassical economics, you think about two factors of production, labor and capital. If I think in terms of classical economics, would this still be true? How many factors? So, does anybody here or at home know? Ah, okay, Alberto Masini, thank you. You were answering to the question. So sorry, I didn't hear a blip from the computer, which is what I get usually when you wrote. Yeah, that was that. So does anybody here or at home have the answer to this question? In classical economics, so I'm talking about people like Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo, what are the factors of production? The same, labor and capital. Pietro Corti says land, correct. In classical economics is labor, capital, and let's write land. Now, somebody if I'm correct, in the 1920s argues that you can collapse land into capital, which I think has serious problems and leads to making, at least in terms of distribution in the long run, leads to make exactly the wrong conclusions when applied to pre-industrial societies. Because in those societies, land is a crucial factor of production, and the difference between land and, for example, capital, other components of capital, financial capital, or whatever, is that land will not tend to dissipate. If you manage this correctly, land keeps its value across the centuries. which of course means that if you start with a very uneven distribution of land, there is no reason whatsoever that the advantage of those who hold more land in year 1 will not be transferred totally to their descendants in year 1 plus 500, right? If you apply instead, as it's commonly done, a depreciation rate, a cost depreciation rate to capital, and you apply that model to a predecessor society, you commit the mistake of depreciating land. So you can come up with estimates. I mean, this again, this is for those of you who are more interested in economic models. You can come up with models which imply that wealth inequality will tend to reduce on its own, so without other factors which produce it, that will tend to dissipate because the original advantage is kind of reduced progressively by the dissipation of the value of land. But that's false. It's false because land, if treated properly, keeps. It does not. Does not. Is not subject to that same law. Anyway, close parenthesis. Now, this is why real wages are relevant to us. And then real wages are a relatively good indicator because we can measure them more or less directly. Now, for East Asia, we are still in a relatively early situation because the estimates of real wages for Japan and for China are pretty recent, and again, there is still much research being done. Now, in this graph, you have real wages in rural England, which is the red graph, rural Japan, which is the blue graph, and rural China, the rural area around Beijing, which is the green graph. Now, what this graph tells you, the period is 1700 to 1875. This graph tells you two things, I think, two very important things. Any ideas? At least in my interpretation, then you might come up with a third very important thing. But so, if you look at this and think in terms of relative levels of development, what would you, how would you comment on this graph? I need a volunteer. Oh, thank you for volunteering. Thanks. How would you comment on this graph? Oh, wait, maybe you have been saved by somebody at home. Abandonment of rural England. No, well, look at the real wages increase in England after 1900. So I don't understand in which sense you are arguing for. Okay. Well, no, I would say that's not abandonment, that more, I mean, you could interpret that as a kind of Malthusian process before the 19th century when you start introducing mechanization and then chemical fertilizers to agriculture, right? So in England, especially at the beginning of the century, there was improvement in that. And then if maybe you are referring to the displacement of workers from the country to the city, and that is something which might increase real wages in rural England because, yes, in this sense, yes, because you have fewer workers offering their labor in the countryside because they move to cities to work in the industries, and this contains that. Right, I would not, however, overinterpret this. I mean, you could read this in either way, and consider that Malthus, for example, writes his book at the very beginning of, well, no, it's the very end of the 18th century. So is kind of describing a situation for the previous period. So this idea that, subsistence level is what the system tends to converge to could be, used to interpret that trend. But there is also, in fact, this other story, which, however, seems to kick in only after 1800. So it's not a story of the first part of the Industrial Revolution, but a story of the 19th century. And then, yeah, it might be that more and more workers are leaving the countryside. It might also be that, in general, the way in which the rural work is organized changes structurally because of these other interventions. Because, yeah. But I think you are referring to the displacement from rural areas to cities, which clearly is part of the problem. Now, in terms of timing, however, What that means is that the trend between England and China was comparable. The real difference happens with the Industrial Revolution, which is when rural wages in England starts growing in this comparison. The other thing which I would have mentioned here is that the wages in England from the beginning of the 18th century are much higher than the wages in that part of China and than the wages in Japan. Okay? Now, for Japan, the series ends at about the period, at about the moment when there is this crucial change in political regime, which is the Meiji Restoration in 1868. That's when the shogunate, which had ruled Japan from the beginning of the 17th century, is basically put aside. And around the emperor, there is a new government which starts a process of modernization of the country. And we don't see that in this graph because that happens after. So again, 2 points. First, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, maybe. And secondly, the difference between the most advanced part of Western Europe, in this case, and East Asia, already from the beginning of the 18th century in this graph. And this is exemplary, yes, exemplary of how you can use real wages to make this kind of broad comparisons. Yes? Yeah, we are looking at rural wages only here. And the point is, if you think along purely Malthusian lines, this means that more people are moving from the countryside to the city, which is a well-known process taking place during the Industrial Revolution. And this reduces the number of workers offering their labor in the market for rural labor. And this will tend to increase real wages because you have to pay better the remaining workers in order to induce them to remain there and not to migrate to cities. And of course, the reason why they migrate to city is that in industry they were getting originally better wages than they could have received in the rural area. So there is, you know, and of course, if we also had urban wages or industry wages, we could see to explore better the interaction. The reason why here the comparison is done between rural areas is that rural Japan is that China and Japan hadn't started the Industrial Revolution yet. So the point was to kind of compare like with like, right? And then Yuzuru Kumon, who, by the way, as a visiting professor to Bocconi, taught this course a few years ago, when I was on sabbatical, basically. Yuzuru Kumon wanted to compare like with like in this case. It doesn't go to the period preceding 1700. We will look at other graphs today in which we will look at comparisons of real wages covering, for example, the period of the Black Death. And so we will have other examples of this. Now, as I said, timing of the grid divergence remains an issue. We have some evidence in favor of certain hypotheses, but this is still not conclusive. This is not something on which everybody agrees. The timing is not neutral in terms of the explanations we give. If we look directly at the explanations, again, to exemplify, we have some explanations which focus on demographic aspects. And remember, per capita GDP is a demo-economic variable. So looking at demography matters. Remember what I told you about the Black Death. Not by chance, these two authors, Clark and partly Broadberry, begin the story with the Black Death, to this huge shock. Then we have explanations which have to do primarily with geography and geopolitics. Geography, Diamond, for example, we already discussed him. We will see that he also has an explanation for the great divergence, not only for why Eurasia and not the Americas. And then Pomerantz, of course. Pomerantz, why geopolitical in this case? Well, because, as we will see, Pomerantz focuses a lot on the advantages that Europe received from the fact of controlling overseas territories, from the fact of having colonies. And then also Wallerstein, as we will see, and Wallerstein will cover later today. And then we have a bunch of authors who focus mostly on institutions. Then, of course, many of these interpretations are pretty sophisticated and they have different elements. Wallerstein, for example, could also be placed in this group, not only in the group of those who focus on geopolitics. Brodel was also very aware of the importance of certain geographic variables in explaining certain trends and so forth and so on. So here, this is a simplification, and I'm stressing what I think for different authors are the main variables, and then, this is the outcome. And we will, however, explore each one of those interpretations in detail during the course. But before looking at these explanations, we have something else to do. We have to look at what happens in those moments in time when there might have been a deep phase of change. I already mentioned the Black Death for the 14th century. We'll go back to that later. Let's think, for now, at what it means to open the Atlantic trade routes, which basically is the same as saying that what were previously separated worlds, plural, open to each other. The concept which I like to use is something which was introduced by a famous French historian of a couple of generations ago, Fernand Braudel. And this approach has then been expanded and modified a bit by Immanuel Wallerstein and the world system theory, and we will go to that later. So the point is this. Braudel explains very clearly that before the great opening of the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, there were basically separated world economies, plural, and he uses the trait in between the words to make this clear. So the point is, this is what exists before the emergence of the first singular, and without the trait, world economy. Singular. The world economies, as he says, are fragments of the world which are economically autonomous and have their own internal hierarchy and organization. Now, in this graph, in this slide, sorry, you have an interpretation of what were maybe independent and separate world economies about 2,500, 2,800 years ago. Fragments of the world, one in North China, one in Northeast India, Egypt, Greece. The red dot there should be Carthage, I think. And the point is, these world economies were, to a significant degree, separated one from the other. Now, the point here is that each world economy is self-sufficient, so you have all you need produced within that area. The vast majority of the product never escapes that area, which is also an area of trade. There are some connections between separate world economies, but very little travels from one area to the other, right? And they tend to have their own hierarchy. So they have an internal center and an internal periphery. To anticipate one conclusion of this discourse, the problem is that when you move from the world economies plural to a world economy, because, for example, it becomes easier to travel by sea from Europe to China or Japan, you set in action a range of changes which alter dramatically everything. They alter the internal economic organization of these world areas which were before separated. They start creating a hierarchy at a much broader level. So the old hierarchies, each one characteristic of a specific area of the world, center, periphery, whatever, will interact with this process, which will lead to the emergence of a center at a much broader geographic scale, and all the rest, to some degree, with respect to the center, will tend to become periphery, and then in overall peripheric areas, you will have peripheries, or if you want, peripheries and semi-peripheries, right? But the point is, you start adding an extra layer until you get the first unified world economy, which is a concept with some connections to that of a global economy, at least from the geographic point of view. Now, when Braudel was talking about this, it's not truly global in the sense of including everything. The beginning of this process excludes, for example, most of Oceania, which is discovered by Europeans later, and which is integrated in the system later compared, for example, to the Americas, right? So it's a dynamic process. But the point is you have these closed world economies, plural, separated one from the other, which start to open because they are put in closer contact, and that process will unavoidably tend to change the way in which trade is organized, the way in which economic production is organized, and the way in which these areas are structured in a hierarchic way. And then, as you will see, Wallerstein, who introduces the world system theory, so instead of world economies, you have separate world systems, stresses much more the political and geopolitical meaning of this, because this is also a process which establishes a different hierarchy of power across the world. And power becomes, especially for Wallerstein, a very important factor in maintaining those hierarchies across, those new hierarchies across time. And we'll go back to that later. Now, the earlier slide with the map was for Eurasia about 2,500, 2,700 years ago. When you think about the Roman Empire in its maximum expansion, well, this is the Euro-Mediterranean world economy. Scotland doesn't fit, if you want. You know that the Romans conquered Britain, Britannia, the province, but then they did not conquer the Picts in Scotland, right? So there is a nice wall that they kind of built. They built two, in fact. There is Hadrian's Wall is still visible in part, and it clearly and physically marked the end of the empire there. But the point is, of course, there were interaction between the Britannia and the northern part, right? But if you want to have an impression of geographically how kind of this also reflects into politics, well, think about the Roman Empire. To the south, the boundary is clear. because that's the Sahara Desert, right? Which is a very important geographic barrier, which doesn't mean that nothing moved across the Sahara Desert, because there were paths to cross it, but very little made the trip. Very few people, highly specialized. And very few goods, only goods valuable enough that it makes sense to move them across the Sahara. Same story for the so-called Silk Road. The Roman Empire and the Han Empire in China exchanged regularly embassies. They weren't trading, however, too distant for that in that moment. But along this axis, this west-east axis, and along the Silk Road, at least for trades of that, there were already goods moving, which came from different world economies. There is also the Indian world economy, which is not represented there because this slide shows the two empires, right? So the Silk Road was one of these very few specialized paths which connected what were otherwise closed worlds. But again, this is of very limited import. The impact of this on the total is very limited. And when I say the impact of this on the total is very limited, I don't only refer to the economic value of the goods being traded. So I said, only the most valuable goods could conceivably move along this path, but the total value of those goods will not be that large, right? It's not, however, only a matter of economics. Also, culture will not, generally speaking, move easily across different world economies. Ideas will be very difficult to bring from one to the other. Not impossible, of course. Not impossible, but very difficult. This is something which happens only very occasionally, and its total impact overall is limited. Again, if you think of the situation looked at from the Euro-Mediterranean area, the main paths connecting separate world economies were, again, the paths across the Sahara Desert and the Silk Road connecting with these other areas of Eurasia. Now, the Silk Road, as you will see, is pretty important in our story because, and I'll go back to that later, the restoration to full efficiency of the Silk Road performed by the Mongol Empire is one of the reasons why the Europeans, some Europeans, were induced to try and get in an easier way from Europe to Asia, because it had become easier to trade along the Silk Road, and because it had become clear that there was a market for certain goods coming from Asia. And then this made it interesting to start a huge project aimed at reaching Asia by circumnavigating Africa, not by traveling west. But the original idea is to circumnavigate Africa. Now, just to reiterate, the great opening of the world is a process. It begins in a period and then it continues. You have these waves of opening which overlap and continue producing ripples continuously through time. And when we think about the opening of the closed worlds, you have to remember, very importantly, this is not only an economic process, it is also a psychological process and a cultural process. This leads to a change, a dramatic change in how different people of the world perceive themselves and their position with respect to the rest. right? This changes everything. This is a crucial moment in human history. And you can also say that this is the beginning of a first phase of proto-globalization. Sometimes you find in the literature the terms of early globalization refer to the 19th century. But in our perspective, this is late. Sure, there is a very important increase in the rate of globalization looking at certain variables in the 19th century, we'll discuss that. But before that, what happens in this moment in time is crucial. And this is the moment when this way of organizing the world economy is plural, starts being compromised. So you now that there was a question from Maui Brennan, why were wages in a clear declining trend with Beijing in that period? I don't remember the article by Kumon, but based on Pomeranz, and we will look at this later in the article. This is again a possibly a Malthusian process, and the point is that China in that period is experiencing, but differently from other world, particularly differently from Europe, didn't have the possibility of either exporting population to the colonies, which contributes to keeping track the Malthusian dynamics, and this is important in particular in the case of England. It definitely didn't have from the 18th and not even from the 19th century the possibility of displacing people from rural work to industrial work. And in Pomeranz's view, this is not a matter of not having the knowledge to start industrial revolution. This is a matter of not being able to do that because they couldn't escape a set of factors which constrained the opportunities that the Chinese economy had, right? So this basically makes China subject in a much starker way to Malthusian dynamics, and this means if you have population growth, you will have continuous decline in rural wages until you reach the point in which you can't have more population without a famine spreading because each additional worker will not be able to produce enough to sustain himself or herself. So that's one way of interpreting that, and this will become clear in future lectures because we will look exactly at the conditions prevailing in Europe and China in the 18th century, and these kind of factors will play an important role in our story. Now, how does all this begin? You might be used to think that the beginning of the story is Columbus, who reaches America on, leading a Spanish expedition in 1492. No, the first actors in this story are the Portuguese. The Portuguese in the 15th century want to do one thing. They want to reach the place of origin of the spices, which the Italian merchant republics, and in particular Venice, were so effectively bringing in from the Levant and selling to the whole of Europe. And the idea here is very simple. If we can get by sea to the Indies, as they said, we will be able to import them on their own, and we will free ourselves from the dependency upon the Venetians. And on top of that, we will have the opportunity of selling ourselves those nice spices to the rich markets of Northern Europe. Problem is, the Portuguese had some very wrong ideas about Africa. They thought it was much shorter than it was in practice. So they thought, well, we can circumnavigate Africa to reach India, but they weren't aware of the sheer size of the African continent. Now, the beginning of this story is 1434, when a Portuguese sailor and explorer, Gil Yanes, and I'm sure I'm badly mispronouncing his name, is the first European who sails beyond Cape Bouhador in Western Morocco. This is a very important moment because everything beyond Cape Bouhador is very difficult. And this is a problem of, for example, the prevailing conditions of the winds, which tend to force you back. So beyond Cape Bouhador, they didn't know how to sail. And that is basically also a psychological barrier, because beyond Cape Bouhador, they weren't sure they were able to make their trip back home. So they had to be very bold. Now, before this, however, we have to remember that the Italian merchant republic, why this is important? This is important. The role that the Italians played in this story is important because this is relevant to our understanding of the so-called little divergence. So the process leading the economic center of Europe moving from Southern Europe, in particular from Central and Northern Italy, to Northern Europe, right? So this will be important for us later. So the Italians, and in particular the competitors of the Venetians, like the Genoese, because Italy was politically fragmented, there were many states competing one with the other in the territory of nowadays Italy. The Venetians were quite happy with having the monopoly of the market of certain spices which they could get from the Levant, but other merchant republics, in particular Genoa, would have been quite happy with displacing the Venetians themselves. So Columbus was a Genoese, not by chance. Before the opening of the trade routes along the African shores, the Italians were also launching expeditions in the open Atlantic. There is this famous expedition by the Vivaldi brothers in 1291. So what do the Vivaldi brothers do? Well, they take their galleys and sail straight west. So the idea of sailing west to reach the east wasn't new to Columbus. On their path, they rediscover the Canary Isles, which were known from Roman times. They were called the Lucky Islands, the Isole Fortunate, but they have been forgotten, generally speaking, abandoned. So they rediscovered them, and they continue from the Canary Isles to move even more to the west, and they disappear. Nobody knows what happened to them. But they were sailing with galleys, and that's the problem. The Italians had a big problem, which was a naval technology problem. And the problem is the kind of ship which had developed in the Mediterranean and was perfectly suited to the conditions of the Mediterranean didn't work well in the Atlantic Ocean. So the galleys don't work well in the Atlantic Ocean. The beginning of the story, it's not due to one individual who has this idea and decided to sail south. No, there is a project actively pursued by Portugal with the direct involvement of the king, in particular Henry said the navigator for kind of obvious reasons. And the first objective that they have is to produce a ship which is well suited for long distance travel in the conditions of the ocean. And what do? Well, they take some innovations from the Mediterranean ships and they combine them with some characteristics coming from big ships with very high sides, which were used, which had a roundish shape. They were the cogs, which were used for trade in the Baltic Sea area, and they produce a kind of hybrid, the Caravel. The Caravel has these characteristics: it is relatively easy to maneuver, using innovations developed first in the Mediterranean area. For example, in the way in which you steer the ship, but has also some structural characteristics coming from this tradition of the northern seas, which make it well suited to resist against the high waves typical of the ocean. Right? So, we could discuss in detail what are the innovations, but it would be a bit kind of beyond the purpose. The point is that the Portuguese were placed, of course, on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, and they had seen these Italian ships sailing from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, which was doable, but what's the problem there? You can do that, but you have to stay close to the coast. Because if you go to the open sea with a galley, you are placing yourself in a great danger. Remember the Vivaldi brothers disappeared without nobody ever knowing what happened. So the Portuguese were seeing these ships moving, and they had direct experience then of the innovation they were introducing. At the same time, they saw in their harbors also these other kind of ships. So they had the idea of combining these. And again, not only the idea, the political ambition of doing this, because again, the king was directly involved. And the whole kingdom of Portugal, in the end, kind of geared up towards this endeavor. And this is why they managed to complete a project which begins in 1434 and ends only in 1498. So it's not one trip which solves the problem. They encounter a bunch of problems. They realize progressively that Africa is much bigger than they thought. So after the first ship by Eanes, so the rounding of Cape Boador, after having won this psychological barrier, after having dared to get into seas which were unknown, uncertain, and you didn't know the winds, and you didn't know whether you would ever be able to make the trip back home, and of course, landing and then moving on foot would have meant to cross areas which weren't very hospitable for the Europeans, so it wasn't really an option neither. And so difficult is to find a way to sail the kind of seas, that it takes the Portuguese 40 years and many journeys, many attempts to reach the Gulf of Guinea. When they do that, they are only half the way down along the coast of Africa. Only in 1488, Bartolomé Diaz returns to Lisbon after, for the first time in history, having doubled Cape of Good Hope, previously called Cape of the Tempest. Then, when they do that, they become optimistic. Now, the interesting thing is the following. Given the conditions of currents and winds along the shores of Africa, when they round for the first time Cape of Good Hope, they realize that while it was very difficult to move along the west shore from north to south, when you start moving along the east shore from south to north, everything is easy. It's like the winds push you towards India. Well, this still takes 10 years. But the fact is the following. Who does Columbus ask to fund his expedition to begin with? Do you know that? Who knows that? Yeah? No. They have the second choice. Where does he go? He goes to the Portuguese. He goes to the King of Portugal and says, I have this idea. So you want to reach the Indies? Well, why don't we sail west? And what does the king say? Well, yeah, nice idea, but we're almost there already. Why should I fund this expedition with high risk when we are pretty sure that we will accomplish this soon enough? True. Soon enough means 1498, when Vasco da Gama reaches Calicut. And by the way, the Portuguese wanted to get to India, and they did. Columbus didn't, right? He got to someplace else. So they say no, And the advantage that Columbus had, maybe compared to other explorers from other parts of the world, there is this nice story about explorations of Admiral Zheng He, who was a Chinese. The advantage that Columbus had, compared to Zheng He, is that he could ask somebody else for support. So he goes to the King and Queen of Spain, or more precisely, to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, who had kind of merged their kingdoms under a personal union because when they married, because they had inherited the kingdom of Castile and the kingdom of Aragon. In 1492, Columbus reaches the Americas. What happens in 1492 in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula? Which is another reason why the king and queen of Spain were fairly happy with this idea. 1492 is another important date in the history of this part of Europe. Very symbolic. That's the end of the kingdom of Granada, which was the last Arabic kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula, okay, which is conquered by Isabel of Castile and Ferdinando of Aragon. So 1492, Columbus reaches America. And also fall of the kingdom of Granada. Which means that precisely around those years, Spain, again, this personal union of Castile and Aragon, then we could, let's call it Spain for the purposes of making our lives simpler, it's kind of reaching a peak in its power and a peak in its ambition. They know that they will get rid of this competitor which was winning in the south of Spain. This also means that geopolitically they were much kind of stronger because they were controlling the whole of Iberia, bar for the kingdom of Portugal, but that wasn't such a threat to them. And then they are also quite happy, however, for exactly the same reason, to fund an expedition which, if they are lucky, will undermine, yes, the Venetians, but also the Portuguese, which are, they are their neighbors, but you don't want your neighbor to become immediately very rich and also to be then forced to buy spices for them. If you have even a slight possibility of finding a way around that problem, and if you have the resources to fund an expedition, because in that moment you are kind of blossoming from many points of view, including from the economic point of view, you do that. You run the risk, you have the resources to do that, and you do that. You have an interest in doing that. So they fund the expedition. So Columbus could start his expedition because he had alternatives. One interpretation of possible advantages of Europe compared to East Asia is that there were more competing states in Europe than there were in East Asia, in which you have much of the area basically controlled by the enormous Chinese Empire. Right? We'll go back to that later, but this is also one factor which can be used to explain the relative advantage of Europe, because, for example, it could make you hypothesize that, given this competition, European states were readier to introduce innovations as they became available, right? Because they had an immediate advantage against their friendly or not very friendly neighbors. Think about timing here, and then we will move on. 40 years to go from Portugal, for the first time from Portugal to the Gulf of Guinea. Then you have another 10, 14 years to go the other half of the path from the middle of Africa to the south, 14 and then 10 years to do an even longer trip along the eastern shore, the shores to India. So this is becoming quicker and quicker. I say the caravel, yeah, but these ships are changing continuously, right? So one part of the story is that, of course, the Portuguese continue to innovate their equipment, and their naval knowledge is better and better. They know more about the conditions of the wind in the Atlantic, on the Atlantic coast of Africa after each trip. And then, when they round the Cape of Good Hope, they find that the conditions of the currents of the wind are actually helping them. They are much easier than what they have experienced in the other part of the trip. So, 1498, India, 1510, they reach the Malacca Peninsula in Malaysia. 1513, they are in China. Quicker and quicker. So they get exactly where they wanted to get, to India and China. 1543, maybe by mistake, they reach Japan. Again, I can't show you in class the nice video we have produced because there isn't a feasible way of doing that with a hybrid format. Look at that on your own, and that tells you a bit about what happens in Japan. We introduced the case of Japan at the very first lecture. There is an immediate interest. The Japanese are extremely curious about what the Europeans could provide. They're also extremely curious about which weapons the Europeans could sell them, because they were going through a phase of continuous war, of civil wars, if you want. And then, after the big battle of Sekigahara at the beginning of the 17th century, when the Tokugawa shogun wins over the Hideyoshi family, Japan decides that in order to preserve stability and also the power of the shogun, it's better to stop the Europeans from interacting with them, because the presence of the Europeans is considered to be something destabilizing for Japanese society. Right? And then you have the beginning of a long phase, which will end only with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which I was mentioning before, right? Which is the moment when Japan opens again, kind of forced to do that by the ships of our new power, which was the United States, and they decided have to start along a path of forced and quick modernization. Anyway, just very brief history of Japan. There is more in the video, but again, we can't talk much about Japan because of time. But it's a very interesting story, the story of the interaction between the Japanese and the Europeans. Okay, now, of course, it's not like the Portuguese were sailing oceans and seas that nobody had been trading across before. Oh, sure, no, they were finding other traders. And the point is that this expansion is also the expansion of Portugal as a naval power. So they basically managed to take over the system of naval trade which existed in the Indian Ocean and in the parts of the Red Sea, and which had been put in place by Arabic merchants. So they kind of integrate that. That's kind of a already organized trading space, which becomes integrated in this new, much broader trading area, right, which connects that to Portugal. And of course, integrating trade from this part of the world into something which has, as its point of origin, Europe, also means that the conditions of trade in that part of the world will tend to become somehow dependent upon the conditions of trade in a center, which is placed, in this case, in another continent. So remember what I was telling you. This process changes the hierarchies at the local level. Beyond introducing new hierarchies at an increasingly global level, it changes the hierarchies, the economic and political and military hierarchies also at the local level. When the Portuguese reach finally China and Japan, they are also able to take over the trade between China and Japan, because that's a period during which the Chinese had forbidden Portuguese from entering their harbors because they were considered to be pirates. So basically, the Chinese had forbidden the Japanese from entering their harbors because they were considered to be pirates. So the Portuguese could profit from this opportunity, starting a triangular trade in the sea, in the northern Chinese Sea, right? And the same happens in the Indian Ocean. They not only trade between Europe and Asia, they also take over these local trades, establishing an overall dominion over the trade routes. What the Portuguese don't do is to take direct control of vast territories. They don't, for many reasons, among which their relatively small size. So they don't have the people to do that. They don't even have the interest in doing that because, well, in Africa, they find things that they are interested in bringing to Europe during their trips. But still, those are not as valuable as the real prize, which are the spices from the Indies, right? So they only establish bases along the shores of Africa. I don't remember whether I have an example here. No. Maybe I have another. Then, at a later phase, they will acquire part of South America, part of nowadays Brazil, but in general, they don't acquire direct control over large areas. The Spanish have a different experience. The Spanish arrive in the Americas, and of course they meet those two polities which we said were relatively advanced, so the Aztec Empire in nowadays Mexico, and the Inca Empire in nowadays Peru. And they managed to conquer both of them very easily for a number of reasons. So one reason is what Diamond highlights a lot, so their advantage in weapons, so in steel, right? The fact that they had horses, which were entirely unknown in the Americas, and the native population were really unprepared to that, also kind of psychologically. And then, of course, the diseases that they brought with them, which led to huge problems among the populations original from those world areas when they became infected, because they had zero knowledge and no natural resistance to those diseases, and also no selection across centuries against those diseases. An advantage of the Spanish was also that there were basically no or almost no serious human pathogens which made the other trip, so which went from the Americas to Europe. Just one, although there is also some uncertainty, which is syphilis, is the important disease which moves from the America to Europe, although this view is also challenged by some today. And syphilis, which today, well, syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, mostly. Today is a chronicizing disease, so it kind of kills you slowly. It kills you, but slowly, and before you go mad, by the way. But at the moment of its original appearance in Europe, had an acute development and killed a lot and very quickly. And then it started to change, to mutate. That's the textbook case of mutual adaptation between humans and pathogens. So syphilis becomes a chronicizing disease from the beginning of the 17th century. Problem is, you can't presume that this will happen each and every time, which is one reason why much of what has been said, especially during the first phases of the pandemic about COVID-19, was, to me personally, I mean, among the things I do is to study past pandemics, to me was very troubling because I could make more examples of infections which become more aggressive, not less aggressive, as they mutate. The case which leads to this idea of co-adaptation between humans and pathogens is basically one, and that is syphilis. Close parenthesis, but one thing is important. Why just one disease moving from the Americas to Europe and many moving from Europe to the Americas? This relates to something which we discussed this morning. This has to do with the epidemic gradient in the forest of Brazil compared to the forest of Africa. At the same point, there are fewer pathogens in the animal reservoirs in the Americas, pathogens potentially harmful to humans because humans have arrived in the Americas relatively late moment in history. Human beings come from Africa. That's why in sub-Saharan Africa you find the maximum concentration of potentially harmful pathogens. So the maximum concentration of pathogens which today exist basically in animal population, but which might jump to a human host and learn to spread human to human. Again, to convince you of this, think about recent example, HIV and Ebola. Both of them appear in Africa. Both of them come from animal reservoirs. And both of them become able to spread between human beings when human beings become more numerous in areas where they were present among the animal reservoirs. Right? So this is an effect of growing population density in the wrong areas of Africa. And this doesn't happen in South America because the epidemic gradient is not as unfavorable. And again, as we were saying this morning, this might be one factor leading to the limited extent of the urban revolution in sub-Saharan Africa, which then might be a very important factor explaining the relative underdevelopment of Africa till today. Now, going back to the Americas, there are also other factors, however. The Europeans were also quite lucky. The Aztec Empire had been built in the preceding decades, and the Aztec, the three cities of the original alliance, weren't particularly kind towards the subject provinces. They were kind of extracting a lot of tribute, including blood tributes if they weren't available to pay tax, by the way. In the case of the Incas, Pizarro reaches Peru exactly at the end of a long civil war between Atahualpa and his enemies. And then, yes, Pizarro is treacherous, he captures Atahualpa, whatever, but in both these policies, the conditions were kind of ideal for the Europeans. Add pandemics and still, in the sense, add the impact of the new diseases, which disrupt pretty much everything, and this contributes to explaining why very few Europeans were able to take over even the most advanced and most developed polities of the Americas. And then there is the well-known population collapse of the Central and South American population, Central and South American areas, which has a lot of reasons, among which surely epidemics, but also a bunch of other reasons. Maybe we'll have time to say more about this, but the point is that the demographic collapse of the America lead the Europeans to need labor force which can't be provided locally, and then this also leads to the introduction of a new trade across the Atlantic Ocean, which is the slave trade from the shores of Africa directly to South America, of which originally the Portuguese, who already have their bases in place, are the main players, later to be replaced by others, including in the end by the English, who become the main actors in the last phase of that trade. Anyway, we'll say something more about the slave trade in future lectures. But this is also a specific trade which fits into the story of the opening of the Atlantic trade routes, and it has to do with economic needs which emerge in South America because of the demographic collapse. Now, before this, there is an antecedent which I already mentioned, which is the restoration to full efficiency of the Silk Road. At the beginning of the 13th century, Temujin manages to unify the Mongol tribes and to basically conquer China, which was, the Chinese Empire was going through a difficult moment. He and his successors then continue spreading their enormous empire across China, reaching basically across Asia, moving westward up until they reach Eastern Europe. In 1279, the conquest of China is completed, and there is the origin of the Yuan dynasty, which is basically a Chinese dynasty with Mongol origins. So the imperial family of the Yuan was a family of descendants of Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan, incidentally, is the guy met by the Venetian young trader Marco Polo, who made all the trip on foot along the Silk Road, described this in, then he tells his story, which are collected in a book which became very famous in the Middle Ages called Il Milione, in which we still have, by the way, interesting information about the situation there. And he actually was received at the imperial court of Kublai Khan in, if I remember correctly, Xanadu, but I might be wrong on this. And then the Mongols become a threat in Eastern Europe because they are kind of trying to expand more, and they make insecure the whole Eastern European areas for many decades. You have a link which I suggest you look on your own about the expansion of the Mongol Empire, which becomes the largest contiguous empire in human history to that moment in time. Now, the restoration of the Silk Road and then the building of an efficient road system across this enormous empire also, of course, serves the military needs of the Mongols themselves. This has a number of consequences. First, you have more products moving, more trade moving along the Silk Road, which makes it, more interesting because it kind of fuels the export of those goods also to Europe, and then contributes to explain why the Portuguese decided they want to create their own road, their own path for bringing in these products from Asia. And then the other important thing which happens because of the good road system introduced by the Mongols is that plague comes back to Europe and the Mediterranean. Plague, or more precisely, Yersinia pestis, which is the name of the bacillus, as it was identified in Hong Kong in the 19th century by the French, I think it was French, it might have been Swiss in fact, by the French doctor, I think French doctor Alexander Yersin, so he gave that his name, was present in the Euro-Mediterranean area till about the 8th century of the current era. It caused a terrible pandemic in the 6th century, which is called Justinian's plague, because it took place during the time of the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Justinian. So it was kind of a Byzantine emperor, and he had been trying to recover also the western part of the Roman Empire. But this whole project was kind of wrecked by the spread of this pandemic, which again might have killed in that period, so the 6th century of the current era, up to about 40% of the population of the Mediterranean area. So again, a terrible pandemic. Then, mysteriously, this infection disappears from the area, Europe, Mediterranean, and the Levant, and also the Middle East, from about the 7th or 8th century of the current era. But as far as we know, it remained endemic in the area of the Himalaya because it was endemic in populations of rodents, in particular among marmots, which, based on a story often repeated, the local populations didn't eat because they were taboo, and they were taboo because they weren't good for your health, as you could get the plague if you ate them. But the Mongols didn't know that. So according to this story, the Mongols reached the Himalaya area. They start eating these poor rodents, and they get infected by plague. Then the plague, of course, spreads with people. And the problem is, as they had restored the Silk Road and built all these nice roads across the area, the plague is able to spread very effectively along large areas, reaching the Black Sea area in 1346, where a Mongol chieftain was besieging the city of Kaffa, which happened to be a colony of the Genoese. So it was a colony of an Italian merchant republic. The besieging army becomes infected by the plague, terrible epidemic in the army. The Mongols have to leave the siege and go away. But before doing that, in an early form, I mean, according to a story as reported by a chronicler of the time, which might be more or less reliable, it surely shouldn't be taken at face value, but the story is nice, and that's also an early example of biological war, because what the Mongols do before lifting the siege is taking some trebuchet and throwing some corpses of people who died from the plague beyond the city walls to infect the city. And then what you have, people become scared of dying of the plague in the city, and then what they do, they escape with their galleys, and where they go? Well, you know, they're in the Black Sea. The first step is going to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which survived till the moment in time, which was also in that moment, I think it was still the largest city of Europe, which becomes infected. They continue sailing, they reach Messina in Sicily, and maybe Toulouse in France already in 1347. And from those points of entrance, the plague spreads to Europe, the Mediterranean, whatever, and kills in the end half the people of the continent. We are less certain about what happens in China, and we will go back to this later, but it seems that the Black Death did not reach in nearly the same way China. It didn't have, as far as we know, the same demographic impact because only certain parts of China were affected. And China was lucky in that moment. But if this is true, well, lucky to a point, because this might have been due to the better hygiene prevailing in Chinese cities compared to European ones, so an advantage in terms of health. But this might have backfired because, according to certain interpretation, like that provided by Greg Clark and Steve Broadberry, this means that China didn't enjoy the advantage of getting this relief from high population pressure of resources, and then you don't have the same process which Western Europe experiences, which might have led Western Europe to get an edge from as early as the 14th century. And we'll go back to this with the next lecture. So I think that we should stop here, also for reasons of time. So next week we will begin exactly here. It's quite normal in this course that some lectures kind of continue in the next one. So this always happens, especially with degree divergence. We will cover the program for the first part by the end of the first part of the course. If there is something left over, it will be in the second part. So this is totally normal because, maybe we discuss things more. I kind of tend to talk a bit more about pandemics given the current situations. Do you have any questions? So also for those of you who were not in class this morning, next Monday, I will give you some details about the descriptive report at the end of the class on Monday. I will put a picture of this nice graph and whatever online by the end of today. Okay, so that's it. If there are no questions, we'll see each other next week. Okay. I am stopping recording now. Okay. And if you haven't done that, record your attendance, but I suppose you already did it.